Today is an awesome video. I came across some amazing data that tracks changes in sexual attitudes and sexual behavior over decades. This is a real treasure. This kind of data is extremely difficult to find. Anything that tracks trends over decades with any kind of consistency is very rare. Like, look at this graph. This goes all the way back to 1937, and that is amazing to actually have data tracked for over 80 years. What you're seeing here is the percentage of men and women who were in love with their first sexual partner. Men are in the green and women are in the orange. As you can see, men are pretty consistent. It doesn't really change much. It just sort of hovers around 50% through all the decades. Women, on the other hand, have changed a lot. You can see that there's been this steady decrease and fewer women have been in love with the man that they lost their virginity to. Back in the late 30s, over 80% of women were in love with their first sexual partner. But by the time you get to 2014, that number had halved to 40%. That is significant because this may be the first time, perhaps in all of human history, that women are now less likely to be in love with a man that they lose their virginity to than men. But of course, they're going to continue with this mainstream myth that when it comes to relationships and sex, men are these disgusting hound dogs and women are these perfect angels and women are these hopeless romantics, and they'll keep pushing this line despite, the existence of that irritating thing we call actual data. Now, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of graphs in this video, and they all tell a very similar story, which is one of increasing moral degeneracy when it comes to female sexual behavior as the result of cultural changes. So if you like it when women are feminine and modest and they inspire men to be better versions of themselves by leading through example, you're probably going to find this video pretty depressing. But on the other hand, if you like data and you like graphs, you're going to love this video, so stick around. Okay, so continuing with this theme of women sleeping with men that they're not in love with, have a look at this graph. All of the lines that you can see plotted here indicate the year that's being sampled. So you can see the black line goes to 1971, and this green line here refers to 2015. As you can see, in younger women, there has been a massive change. Like just a few decades earlier, only 30% of young women would say that they would be willing to have sex without being in love. That's not that long ago. That's just in 1992. But now, 80% of women say that they don't care if they're in love with the person that they're having sex with. And it's only a tiny minority that look for that prerequisite of love. You can actually plot this trend. You can see that every single year, love gets less and less important when it comes to sex. And there's every indication that that trend is going to continue in the future. Now, you might think that this just indicates changes in sexual attitudes across the whole culture. We're destigmatizing sex, there's less shame, going through this sexual revolution. But if that was true, then it would apply culture-wide, equally to men and women. But if we look at the data, we see that that is clearly not the case. Have a look at these two graphs. What you're seeing here is the percentage of men and women who have had at least 2 sexual partners in the last year. When I'm looking at this data, I always find it most interesting to look at the youngest demographics, the 18 to 24-year-olds, because as the youth of the culture, they are the best barometer for measuring actual changes in attitudes. So if society starts to shift in their priorities and their beliefs, then those changes are going to ripple through the younger people first. Now you can see that for women, the number hovers around 35%, and that's pretty consistent. It's been that way for a number of decades. So you think, all right, well, that's not really interesting. It hasn't changed, it just stays the same. So that doesn't really indicate any shift in societal attitudes. Except that it does when you realize that for men, there has been a massive shift. And then you start to ask, well, why hasn't there been a corresponding change when it comes to the data for women? So you see here, decades earlier, for men, the number was similar to women's. It hovered around 40%. But now, in 2015, it has halved and is less than 20% for men. That is an incredible statistic. It means that young women are twice as likely as young men to have had 2 sexual partners in the last year. Twice as likely. That is a huge discrepancy, and it reflects women's increased freedom to be able to indulge their hypergamy. At first glance, you think, well, this doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't the numbers be equal? For every woman that needs to have sex, there should be a corresponding man, so the numbers should be the same. But what you're seeing here is the societal trend for sexual access to be concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer men. As women feel empowered to indulge their hypergamy, they only want to sleep with the top men, which means that those really high status individuals, those men who sit at the top of the pyramid are having lots and lots of sex with lots of women, but the average guy is increasingly left out. This is a worrying trend because if it continues, it could lead to civil unrest, because these men are not going to feel invested in society, they're not going to feel invested in their community, and that's going to lead to an increase in antisocial behavior. Now, there are a few other explanations as to why young men are having fewer partners, whereas women are not. One cause is that young women are more likely to be shacking up with older men. Again, this is driven by hypergamy. Women are seeking those top status men, and she might only be 22 years old, but why would she want to be with a 22-year-old boy who hasn't achieved anything yet, when the men in their 30s who are high status and high wealth, they're showing her interest? Like I've said in my other videos, when it comes to dating, being in your late teens and early 20s is one of the roughest periods of men, because all of the women of your age group that you're interested in are also the women that every other man of all the other age groups are interested in. And so the competition is fierce, and because you haven't really achieved much in your life, you're sort of at the bottom of the pyramid. Another explanation that is very rarely spoken about is that women are looking at other women as viable sexual options and just leaving men out of the equation altogether. Look at these two graphs. In this top one, you're looking at women who admit that their sexual attraction goes beyond just men. It used to be quite low, hovering at around 10% a few decades earlier, but if you see the figures for 2015, for young women, it has jumped up to 40%. That is a huge percentage of women who are explicitly bisexual, and there's every indication that that trend is going to continue. This bottom graph shows a similar trend. Back in 1992, only 5% of these young women had had a sexual experience with another woman, but come to 2015, that number has quadrupled to 20%. If you're an average guy in your early 20s and you want to have sex with a woman, it has never been harder. Competition has never been more intense. We are supposedly living in the age of sexual liberation, but for young men, it would be more accurately called the age of sexual frustration. Like, look at these two graphs. You can see here that in 2015, the median number of sexual partners for women aged 18 to 24 was 5. But when you look at this graph for men, you see that their number of median partners is 2.5. This isn't some outlier or anecdotal evidence. This is data taken from an entire population of people, and it shows that young women have had twice as many sexual partners as young men. Like I said, it's the age of sexual liberation for women and the age of sexual frustration for men. So let's look at some other ways that women are becoming more sexually liberated. There's this graph which shows the average age that men and women were when they lost their virginity. The female line is orange, and you can see this continuous downward trend where the age in which women were losing their virginity just gets lower and lower and lower. By 2009, it had gotten to 16.5 as the average age for women, and that is 11 years ago. There was every indication that the trend was going to continue, so who knows how low it is now. I think we need to ask ourselves, is this a good thing? Is this actually empowering for women to be losing their virginity at earlier and earlier ages? And remember, if age 16 is the average, that means that there are many women who lose their virginity much earlier. Like, for every girl who loses her virginity at age 19, there is another girl who loses her virginity at age 13. I don't know, I might be alone here, but I think that this trend is worrying. This is another interesting graph. This shows changes in attitudes for what sexual acts women feel are perverse. The green lines are their opinions in 2007, and the orange lines are their opinions in 2015. As you can see, everything across the board is less stigmatized now than it was 8 years ago. Sadomasochism, down from 75% to 58%. Group sex, down from 64% to 49%. Porn, from 25% to 16%. Just look at that entire trend, how much stigma has decreased in a short period, just 8 years. And I don't think I'm being a sexual prude here, but I have to imagine that it's not fantastic news for all the fathers out there that their daughters are now growing up in a society where there's less stigma around anal sex and swinging. In case you're wondering, the study that I was referencing in this video came from Finland. They have a bunch of other really interesting graphs that came along with their study, and I've got a link in the description box below if you want to click on that and check out more info. When should you tell a girl that you like her? Should we completely ignore our biology and ignore a woman's appearance when choosing a partner? And what do you do if, after being rejected by a woman, she offers you friendship? All of these topics and many more are covered in exclusive videos available on my Patreon page. This includes my latest video, What is the evolutionary explanation for why human beings masturbate all the way to orgasm? In this video, I talk about the masturbation habits of animals and to what degree humans are unique in finishing and going to climax. I give the evolutionary explanation for why human beings in general and men in particular are horny all the time. I talk about the important ways that human beings are different from animals and the psychological benefits that come from masturbation. And lastly, I give the biological explanation, why it's a good idea for your physical reproductive health to have orgasms as a man, as well as the explanation for female orgasms and why that's also a good idea for them. If you've been curious about your own masturbation habits and to what degree they fit within an appropriate evolutionary framework, I highly recommend you check out this video. For every video that I post here on YouTube, I post an additional bonus video on my Patreon page. That means that at the moment, you're only seeing half of the total content that I create. If you would like access to the other half, then please go and sign up at my Patreon. It's just a $5 a month subscription and you get instant access to a whole bunch of exclusive content. It's a wonderful way to support the channel and I would love to see you over there.